the Home Office's guidance around right to work checks changes regularly, partly to reflect changes in the immigration rules, but also to try to keep pace with the changing landscape of illegal working, making it so important for employers to stay on top of their compliance processes. And potential value of illegal working for organised crime in the UK is huge, and that means the risk and threat to employers of illegal working remains a real and present issue more than ever. And with advances in technology, that means that illegal workers can make their way into an organisation, and the means through which they do that is changing at a rapid pace. So today we'll be looking at how employers stay up to date and adopt robust procedures to address these threats, but at the same time also ensure that the issue doesn't become so burdensome for their organisations that they can't function optimally. How do you balance out those two competing things? And also, with the significant increase and uptake we've had in the use of IDSPs since it was introduced post-COVID, how can advances in technology be used as a tool to respond to these ever-changing threats? I'm Adam Williams. This is the DMH Stallard Employment Podcast, and with me today to talk about right to work checks and how technology can support the prevention of illegal working and manage employer risks in this area are Julia Terry, HR Director for Tenpin. Julia's chartered FCIPD with senior level experience across leisure, hospitality, consultancy, academia, retail, luxury retail and food distribution. Julia's been with Tenpin for 2.5 years, but was also Tenpin's original HRD from 2003 to 2010. So we're very lucky that Julia's here and can provide insights on the journey that she and Tenpin has taken in dealing with the issues we're going to be talking about today. Thanks for joining us, Julia. We also have Tony Machin, CEO at Trust ID, and most of you listening will have heard of Trust ID in the same way you would have heard of Tenpin. Trust ID are a leading provider of identity verification services. They've been providing identity documentation validation technology for over 10 years, way before IDSPs became a thing, and in 2022 became a certified identity service provider as part of that right to work check scheme to support digital scheme checks on British and Irish passports, which has become a potentially invaluable tool, obviously, for employers post-COVID, particularly with now the increased prevalence of remote working. We're very privileged to have the opportunity to hear from Tony some of the trends that the organisation is seeing around imposters and illegal working, and also how IDSPs like Trust ID can be used to optimise your approach as a business and free up valuable time within your organisation, which I think is where the two experiences here kind of coalesce and meet between you both. Tony, thank you for joining us as well, around that optimization approach. So starting with you, Julia, and to set the scene, could you just take a moment just to explain your journey in terms of challenges that the organisation has faced around right to work checks at Tenpin and how you have developed your approach into the use of technology and how that came about?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So going back to my introduction, you'd notice that I've been with Tenpin twice, and originally as Tenpin's original HR director in 2003. I have the benefit of seeing how things have changed in terms of how we do it from sort of 21 years ago. At that time, very manual. We had to rely on our management at our sites to conduct those physical checks. And just for a little bit of context for our business, so we have 54 sites all over England, Scotland and Wales. We have 2,200 people. Vast majority of those are aged between 18 and 24, which helps us with a kind of digital perspective. And we used to do everything so manually, and everything that we did on the onboarding and raising contracts and offer letters and obviously right to work. But in 2020, the business moved to providing using Trust ID for doing digital checks, and then in 2022 we moved to the actual digital checking for British and Irish passports. So for us, because we have such a large number of employees and being in this particular sector, which has challenges around attrition rates, it's really crucial for us to make sure that our onboarding and right to work checking process is both quick and efficient, but also robust to ensure that we are compliant at all times. So for us, our partnership with Trust ID actually is a really important one, because some of our sites know that, if they're doing a certain type of check, they don't need to worry about part of it. But then there are other checks actually that they are very much involved in when it comes to things like expired passports or birth certificates and NI and share codes, so on and so forth. So things have changed really quite dramatically, and I guess that mirrors how the landscape has changed for everybody in terms of how we are doing our right to work checks, our onboarding, and therefore our compliance.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and we'll come back to that point about quick and efficient, but also robust. How finding that balance, clearly a key point for you guys in setting up your procedures and balancing those two things. So that's really helpful. Tony, moving to you, maybe you could give us a bit of an inside track here. You're on the inside of these trends in terms of illegal working and impersonation. What are you seeing, just feeding into that point about the landscapes, as Julia said, the landscape's constantly shifting, process has got to be efficient and deal with that in an optimized way. What are you seeing happening on the ground, so to speak?
Yes, thanks, Adam, and hi, everybody. So first of all, let me just address very quickly how the threat has changed, or the threat of illegal working has changed over the last few years. Obviously, what we've seen over the last several years is Brexit, then COVID, and post-COVID, the introduction of digital schemes, particularly around the Irish, obviously, Irish and UK passports. Prior to Brexit, obviously, the main document that illegals were using were European identity cards, predominantly Spanish, French, Portuguese, were the prevalent documents of choice. Once those are obviously ruled out post-Brexit, BRPs, biometric resident permits, became the counterfeit document of choice for illegal working, and then clearly they were stopped being allowed for as evidence of right to work in 2022. And then with the introduction of the digital scheme in October 2022, what we've seen is a significant increase in share code imposters. So this is actually a trade. There are people essentially probably selling their share codes or giving it to friends. So the people applying for the work are not the people who own the share code. We've seen a significant increase in fake UK documents, and I'll come back to why that's important. And we've also seen an increase in document imposters. So that's actually people trying to apply for work using other people's identity, real, genuine identity documents. And then lastly, the most surprising one, well, say not surprising, the one that may be of most interest, it wasn't surprising to us at all, is we've seen a significant increase in the use of counterfeit Irish passport cards, because an Irish passport card obviously allows you all the same access as a British passport. And ID cards, hence you had the ID cards pre-Brexit, are much easier to counterfeit than passports.
That's really interesting, yeah, because that tells you the opportunistic nature of what people we're dealing with here, because that's a throwback, I guess, to what you were saying at the start. It used to be Euro identity cards. Well, the one remaining vestige is the Irish identity card, because Irish are uniquely positioned as being both in and out of the EU in the sense of...
Yeah, if you look at our nationality stats, if you would look 3 years ago, Ireland was not even the top 20 of threats in terms of countries counterfeits. It's now number 2.
Wow.
It only sits after British documents. So anybody who's using or doing checks themselves and are seeing Irish passport cards, I would advise look at them very closely, or use technology. The second point, I suppose, on therefore understanding that threat and understand how that's changed, is then how do you actually look at mitigating that threat as an employer? Now, clearly, the digital scheme is very robust, so we see very, very few imposter stroke fake documents on the digital scheme. And just to be clear, the digital scheme I'm talking here about is the UK and Irish in-date biometric passports and passport cards. So we don't see many on actually presenting them in a digital means. What we do see is then people, as I say, doing share codes. So, how can you help defend against that? Well, either your staff have to be very well trained in terms of making sure they're checking the face against the photograph in the document, or you're using technology like ours where we'll do a selfie and actually match the applicant against the photograph in the share code and report the visa that comes back. And then lastly, you've got the in-person and the in-person checks, which is where a lot of illegals going because they know that the digital checks are robust. what they'll do is actually either have an out-of-date passport, and they'll have a real document, which is where you get the imposter type element, and or they'll just choose an out-of-date a counterfeit out-of-date British passport, and they'll say, I don't want to go down the digital scheme. They'll turn up in person with some kind of counterfeit document, and hopefully that the person who's checking it doesn't have the knowledge or expertise to check that document for its validity. And so in reality, what you need to look at is whether you're a centralized recruitment process or whether you've got a, like Julia's organization is dispersed across a country and you've got hiring managers. What you need is a platform that can actually support all of those applicant journeys, whether it be digital, share code, and or in person. And that is the only way you're actually generally going to protect, because the illegals are working and will push against the most open door and the easiest route in.
That's fantastic. A really great insight. And I think that segues nicely into coming back to Julia, really, and talking about your route into using Trust ID for British Irish, what most people think of as the traditional identity or technology based checks. And this point about, you still need to be ready to adapt and recognize and respond to the different types of checks we still have, because there's just so many now compared to sort of 10, 15 years ago.
So all of our recruitment is done through an applicant tracking system. So we don't kind of take anybody that just kind of turns up and with a document. Everything has to go through the system. And we have Trust ID fully integrated into that system. So absolutely everything goes through. We also do use Trust ID in a non-integrated way, so we can do manual checks separately if we want to, but absolutely everything goes through that. So,
and just to be clear, it's not necessary to be signed up and always using British and Irish passport checks for that. That is an onboarding function.
Yes.
That can exist and that you were using for many years. You've developed that relationship over many years. Yeah.
That's right. Because as I say, the nature of the sector that we're in, we do see a lot of turnover. We see a lot of seasonal fluctuations, a lot of movement of people depending on the time of year and the weather, that type of thing.
Yeah,
so
sure.
So for us, yes, it is very important. So when somebody joins the organisation, they've been through the recruitment process, an offer is made, the first thing that we do is a right to work check. So obviously that's really kind of straightforward if it is the current biometric British or Irish passport, and that kind of they sit in a swim lane in our system, and once that check's been completed, then if it's a digital check, it moves straight automatically to the next lane, which means that our managers don't need to worry about it, because we've got that statutory excuse to protect us. Yeah. But where it's a different type of check, such as birth certificate or NI number or a share code, then obviously the managers do have to check. And it helps with Trust ID, the fact that there is like a verification screen where they have to certify that they've seen the documents. But of course, it's still incumbent upon us to train people in what they need to be looking out for, just in case somebody is comes in and their documents are not genuine. But it's not, you can't rely completely on any system. So you have to take responsibility for the checks yourself. So we have quite a robust process. We're very lucky we've got the great process that we have, but we ensure that every day, every new starter is actually checked by my team at head office to make sure that we've picked up and there's nothing that we can identify that would cause an issue. Where we have overseas students, and we do have quite a lot, then there's obviously a greater burden, because we've got to make sure that we are keeping them to the right amount of hours that they are allowed to work. So we have kind of built out that process to include student declaration, and that's all sent out by electronic signing software. Again, making sure that we keep up to date with there's courses actually that the Home Office run if you are a sponsor license holder, on understanding kind of right to work. So again, it's keeping my central team very up to date with all the information and changes, but also making sure our managers are, but making sure that we are checking, that we are double checking everything that's being done, and we don't kind of, as I say, absolve our responsibility in that regard.
Yeah, just jump on one point there in particular. You talked about the manager's involvement, and of course you're doing that in terms of satisfying ourselves of the check at the back end of most of those. I really like that expression of swim lanes. Someone verifies at the back end at the human level. Some of my less fortunate clients have had these situations where actually the person who comes to interview, so to speak, and does the right to work check is the person for whom the evidence of right to work relates. It is them, but someone else completely different turns up to work, maybe not on day one, but maybe on day 5 and thereafter. So I think it's helpful for everybody listening to have, if you haven't been unfortunate enough to see that really emphasizes this need to have a sort of holistic approach, doesn't it?
It does, and that did happen to us. We had they were brothers actually. So the one that came for the interview was not the one that turned up. But fortunately, our manager was extremely vigilant and picked it up straight away. So we avoided that situation. But the other thing I would just come back on briefly, which I meant to say, was we're quite lucky that the majority of our workforce are aged between 18 to 24, so they are very tech savvy. And I think one of the key things that I find really useful about using Trust ID is the fact that it's very easy for them to do. It's quite straightforward. Uploading the selfie. The challenge sometimes we don't understand. Sometimes you get people that don't understand what a live selfie is. But in all honesty, I will probably count on one hand the number of times we've had to explain that. That's and over the hundreds and hundreds of checks that we do, that is also a really kind of unique selling point, I guess, for this type of technology, is that we don't want the whole process to be too onerous on the checking side. So again, actually doing it that way is a very simple thing to do.
You make a good point about how everybody's process needs to reflect their organisation and its sector, its needs, and an organisation with a different demographic might be saying, no, we have to do that very regularly because our cohort of typical joiners are not tech savvy. The point being, they adapt and you adjust your process to meet your circumstances, don't you? Which is, it's fascinating when we think of the different challenges that come from specific employer context and sector.
But do you think, though, Adam, that in all honesty, even though we do predominantly have that younger workforce that do tend to be more tech savvy, I'm definitely not in that demographic, sadly, anymore. But
no, nor I. You're not alone.
I could quite honestly, hand on heart, say that it is a very, very simple process that even someone of my dancing years would find very easy to use too. And I think that's critical for many organisations.
Yeah, Tony, I guess a question come to mind in a sec, but just quickly, when we look at sort of risk management processes, right to work checks, I've tended to in training sessions talk to employer delegates about what may seem sort of fairly intuitive and obvious things around the online right to work check system. We'll come on to how you can assist with that, and by that I mean share code based, but things like being really careful to ensure you don't receive an email saying here's a link to the employer portal, click on this link and check, you'll find my result there. Robust approach says no, it's going to come from a central source because the person will have put your details in as the employer, or the other person if it's a third party checking. So you should be always going back to source. It's a bit like getting a spoof website, isn't it? You think you're on the website of your bank and actually it's not. I can see you were saying there's a market to buy and sell share codes. I guess that's just one little example of how employers have got to be alive to the very clever ways in which people might make you think you're in the official process, but you're not, or that it is the person you think it is, but it isn't.
Yeah, I don't think we suffer a lot of that because all systems obviously need to be entirely secure and robust, so we don't get a lot of that kind of thing. I think that when the share code abuse, if we can call it that, is very much about sending a genuine link from a genuine organization, whether that come from Trust ID, because quite often it will come from us if it's more standalone clients, because not everybody's integrated as Tenpin is to an ATS. We're integrated to, I think, now 28 ATS systems, and in those instances it will come from a recognized, so they're trying to apply to Tenpin, and it'll come from Tenpin, but if they're using us as standalone, it'll come from Trust ID. And so there should be, if the employer's doing their part of the process correctly, the applicant should obviously be expecting this. But when they get that that email asking them to upload their document and take a selfie, which of course is all stuff we don't want going out into the ether, or upload their share code and date of birth, it is at that point where what they're actually doing is that, so they're getting a genuine email. They are an applicant who's trying to get work, in this case illegal, and what they're then doing is inputting their mate's share code and date of birth. And there's nothing we can do to protect against them doing that, because it does require that input. What obviously we then detect is when it comes back to us, they've taken, and I actually find it extraordinary that they don't realise this, because they've been asked to take a selfie. It becomes blindingly obvious.
The result.
The selfie doesn't match the photograph that's in the share code. And we're not talking about one or two a week here. We are talking about a significant number.
And I guess a key point there, it might be stating the obvious, but for those who just will use the share code system, they'll go it alone and do it as an organisation without Trust ID behind it. But it seems to me that the system isn't able to recognise that share code doesn't match the date of birth and the name, so flags up. It's not going to give you a red alarm bell at that point, is it, and reject it and say, no, hang on, that doesn't match our underlying record.
No, they've got the real data. They've got a real share code, which has been generated by their mate, who's probably asked for 50 quid for the privilege of it. So it's a real share code with their date of birth. So that brings back the real report. What then happens is that how is an employer or a hiring manager, maybe a HR assistant in this instance, in some instances, do they have the ability to actually stand there and look closely at the applicant and say, well, actually, that doesn't look like the person that's in this photograph e-visa report? And then do they have the courage to start challenging? Because we all know in certain circumstances that's quite a hard thing to do. Now, we take all that away from that by obviously the process that we use. So by the time they actually do the final imposter check, which is to make sure, as you were pointing to, that the person who turns up for work is the person whom we've checked, they have then got a selfie of the applicant, they've got the photograph in the e-visa, and that will actually say, well, that's the right person. Then the person still needs to be checked, but at least there's a lot more comfort at that point that we're doing it. So it's not a completely fail-safe system when you're looking at faces, because that's a very personal judgment, but it's considerably more robust and honestly, as evidenced by the significant number of imposters that we are finding when we're forcing them to take a selfie. I'd hate to think of those organizations who are not doing that, how many are slipping through the system.
That's exactly makes the point, doesn't it? And we come back to this combined approach, because of course there's very clear evidence of human error in facial recognition. There'll be a probably lesser margin. There is scope for error in AI or technology-based facial recognition, but one way or another, if you've got a combination of the two, you're probably in the best position. I would say, obviously, as a lawyer, I'm looking at risk management, but then there's the practical question of what is realistically feasible and what is proportionate to our risk. And we might just touch on that point, Tony, because you and I talked about this before this session. The distinction that some employers don't necessarily have clear in their minds, and I understand it because it's not always easy to be clear in the guidance exactly where it sits, as between a check that gives you a robust sense of risk management, that's a robust check and we can be confident that there's very little chance of that person turning out to be illegal later, and the distinct point about having a statutory excuse. I think it's a good point to talk about it, because it goes to this point you mentioned about actually you can have a greater robustness in a share code check by using Trust ID. You can also then choose whether or not to do your own human intervention steps that are required for the statutory excuse. Do you want to just talk people through that? I could talk about this point all day, but I'll bore the listeners. Yes. Do you want to do it in the non-lawyer kind of more accessible way of describing that in terms of the choice that an employer has?
Yeah, and this is one of the probably in the early days of digital, this is one of the most common questions I got and spent a lot of time on a lot of webinars, a lot of lawyers and a lot of HR directors just explaining. And the guidance is not well written, but the guidance, when you understand it and do read it very carefully, is very clear. So if you're using an IDSP, and don't forget, IDSPs were only created to deal with the right to work digital right to work scheme, i.e. UK and Irish
British and
passports.
Irish.
That's the British and Irish in-date biometric passports or passport cards. Okay, so that's what an IDSP can do. And if you do everything that you want to do with an IDSP that is certified, and you do it properly, including that final imposter check, so the person who turns up is the person who we've checked, then you get a statutory excuse.
Yeah.
No questions asked. If you're using IDVT, and remember we were providing IDV to organisations like Julia's before the digital scheme, then IDVT can be used, and it's very clear. And I'm slightly bored. Page 17 of the Home Office Right to Work guidance, very clear, says that you could have used and possibly using IDVT before digital scheme came in, and that allows you to use us for share codes, or using IDVT technology for share codes and in-person physical document checks. But if you use an IDVT for that, you will not get a statutory excuse. So you can outsource the functionality, but you can't outsource the responsibility. However, final point is, your chances of actually falling foul of an immigration enforcement visit, if you've used IDVT in your processes, is obviously significantly reduced, because we are providing that consistency, that robustness, the electronic and physical evidence as when required about the checks that have been done. So the chances of you needing a statutory excuse are incredibly reduced if you're using good, proper IDVT in those IDSP British Irish passport scenario, so share codes and birth certificates and out-of-date passports. And I think that is the bit people have get confused about. They think, oh, I'm using an IDSP, but I can't use them for share codes because it only says in the UK. You can, you just don't get the statutory excuse. But I would argue, why would you be concerned about that if we've just significantly increased the bar in terms of your compliance and your robustness?
Yeah, I mean, and that sums it up perfectly. And of course, that is the big the why is the big question. I know of clients who will, at one end of the spectrum, be very wedded to the statutory excuse and say, why would we're so entrenched? We just always want our lovely statutory excuse. We need that, and it's okay. And then there'll be others who look at it on a risk-based model and say, actually, but what are the parameters, or what are the time and cost implications of taking that step? Can it really be justified? And that might be the best person to ask on this. How you come to form a view on that would be you, Julia, in terms of what position you've ended up taking on that. You could be over the end of the spectrum of what we still try and get a statutory excuse wherever we can, or at the other end where we go, look, actually, no, we look at the risk, and as long as the risk profile is reduced so much, because these are such robust checks, we go forward. And you will have factored in, Julia, I think it's right to say you're a licensed sponsor of work visas, so there's another layer of oversight with that. So you don't have to give away any actual details of what you, but how did you take that risk-based approach to sort of deciding what you do?
I think it's because of the volume that we have, and the speed in which that kind of volume sort of churns. We needed to have something that was kind of quick and efficient, but robust as well. And because we're confident in the processes that we have, and the help that we get with those via Trust ID and what we do internally, we're happy to kind of accept the risk in turn for the efficiency. Yes, there is obviously a cost attached to it, but I think it's kind of outweighed by any kind of potential penalty, I guess, that we could sort of face, because I think it just gives us a level of confidence, actually, that we're prepared to accept the level of risk. And in the kind of 21 years, I'm going to touch my head here, touch wood, in the 21 years that I have kind of had an association with the business, we've not had a problem. We've, yes, this year become a sponsor license holder. So we understand that, that could bring us an audit at any time. But, I'd be quite happy for anyone to come and audit us. And, I can't hand on my heart say that nothing's ever, gone past us, but I would be surprised. But I think I'd be quite happy to say yes, come and audit us and look at what we do, because I'm quite proud of the kind of lengths that we go to in that regard.
Well, I agree, and I think at Keep we do a lot of work around audit and supporting clients with audits, and one of the key points there is, if you're in an audit scenario, you will be able to answer with an informed, reasoned explanation for why you do things the way you do, as opposed to in an audit someone going, oh, does that not give us a statutory excuse? Oh, didn't realise that. And then that clearly doesn't breed confidence in the Home Office. They go, so you thought you had a statutory excuse and you don't, rather than you made a conscious decision that, given the factors of authentication that sit behind it, we made a conscious risk-based decision in this area, and clearly we've got this swim lane for this and this for that, which creates a totally different perception.
But we also are very kind of rigid around self-auditing ourselves. So we can, quite lucky that we can run data very easily. And we then go through and check. So I can kind of strip out all of my British passports and my Irish passport, because I know that they're going to be okay. But all the ones where the risk lies, we go through and we audit them. And I would say we probably audit ourselves at least twice a year. Only because I am just very particular about sort of trying to mitigate, because the risk is such a lot of money. I mean, when I first was kind of sort of doing this, I think the fines were started at about 10,000, and then now they're like 60,000. 45.
First offence 45. So they've more than doubled.
And then that can be game changing or even game ending for some organisations. So, and and along with that goes the reputational damage, and it's a bit of a minefield, but you've got to just be on it, I think, and vigilant.
I would just add a quick comment to that as well. Compliance is a cost. Okay, so we all know that. So actually, in many ways, and what I think Julia's alluding to is that, by using technology, you will only get a statutory excuse, which is kind of the point you were talking about, if you've absolutely done your process outside the digital scheme. So all of the others, the non-UK British holders of in-date biometric cards, if you've done that process as set out in the guidance, and an immigration enforcement will inspect that. So you don't get a statutory excuse by I want one. You only get one if you've done the process right and you're inspected, and it's only immigration enforcement that can give you a statutory excuse. So the better your processes are, then the more chances you will get that statutory excuse. And therefore, if you've got a process which is doing all these checks, and you've got internal audit, you've got training, you've got, especially on a dispersed location, then you've got to try and make that compliance requirement, yes, robust, but secondly, you've got to make it highly efficient. And the other bit that people forget around all of this is that people get really, really focused when you're talking about organizations like mine about the validity of documents, i.e., is it a real counterfeit document? Actually, we do validity and eligibility checks, and the vast majority of right to work decisions which we turn down are because it is ineligible, because the hiring manager or the applicant, whoever, has sent us incorrect documentation or insufficient documentation. The percentage that fail because of documents, imposters, facial biometrics failing is actually relatively small when compared to things like we haven't got the proof of change of name, or we haven't got the right term time for the student on the share code, or somebody who's still uploading a BRP when it's not actually real evidence. Take all that into equation. We're turning down about, on average, 6.5% of all right to work checks out of the 250,000 we do a month, because it's not the right documentation, not because it's fake documentation.
Yeah, really good point. It can be genuine and verify that's the individual, but just not be the one that you need.
Exactly that.
What you're saying.
So it's validity and eligibility we've got to think about.
Yeah. Now look, we could. I could carry on talking to you both about this all day, but we're conscious of time. I'm going to put one more question to you, Tony, and then I'll do what we normally do, if you don't mind. I'm going to do a wrap up. We'll ask each of you if you could just give one recommendation or takeaway to people listening, what would it be? But the question was, Tony, it goes to the point we've said about fail rates of human facial recognition and digital based. There've been some horror stories about inaccurate results from facial recognition. I shared with you when we spoke before about a situation in Canada. I'm going to keep it deliberately vague, but someone who'd been picked up on facial recognition seeking to change their driving license, but had been matched to who was a legal asylum seeker, but was then matched to an illegal asylum seeker and deported. And there's now a whole appeal level court cases going on about them being in a country they've never been to before and getting them back. We know humans have got pretty poor performance in this area as well. I should just double underline. But is that something that troubles you and Trust ID? How do you seek to build in the systems? Does it keep you awake at night? Is my question really.
Yeah, so my biggest concern has always been since day one in this business is saying a document is counterfeit when it's genuine, or you say on facial biometrics. So we absolutely have very robust systems. So if you take the facial biometric as the one you've just brought up as an example, is that if the system fails it, then every time a system fails it, it will be checked before we send it by a human. We have a human team, UK-based analysts. Trained in facial biometrics and document validation, and they will look at it, and when they've looked at it, they will have to have a second opinion manager sign off. So there are a software decision, then a human analyst opinion, then a manager on facial, and that's the same with documents. So nothing goes back to a client that we say is counterfeit or is not the same person or the right person and doesn't match the photographs unless there's been at least 2 humans look at that and verify that. And if we're not certain, if the face matching is not certain, it's failed the software, and then absolutely we will go back to the client and say, in the very, very, very rare occasions, we don't know, and therefore we suggest you do another check. So that is the one thing. We are utterly robust. And by the way, all of our counterfeit documents go to the police database of counterfeit documents, and they check, and we've never in 11 years got one wrong, so we're pretty confident we get it right.
That's great to hear. And does that trigger a different charging level, or is that something that we don't have to go into detail of pricing, but in terms of the service, you do a check and that's part of it? If in the very rare instance it needs 3-factor,
yeah,
that's part of the arrangement.
It's all part of the pricing. So we do not. You pay for a check, and it doesn't matter whether it's taken 5 seconds to go through digitally and automatically, which is the vast majority, or whether we've had to do an eligibility check on it. We've had to check the student term time, and that's a physical set of eyes we have to do that with, or whether we've actually spent 3 analysts and a manager poring over whether the face is the real face. That's all the same price.
Yeah, really, really helpful. I think that's really important for listeners to hear and to build confidence in on that point. So it's been great. Thank you both. I'm going to do the and finally bit now, which is to each of you in turn, if there's one piece of guidance or recommendation from your journey in this area that you would give to employers listening and that you've learned, what would it be? And I'll start with you, Tony.
So illegal working has not disappeared despite all of the new schemes, and therefore illegal workers will always try and find the easiest route in to find work with employers, and therefore it's important that employers understand that risk, understand their onboarding processes, and make sure that they're doing robust checks for all onboarding processes, whether it's digital or non-digital.
Yeah, fantastic. And Julia?
I think for me it's about responsibility. So as an employer, understand what your responsibility is and take that responsibility seriously. Services like those provided by Trust ID are brilliant, but they go so far and they can't absolve you of every responsibility. So you just need to understand that and just be careful and take responsibility.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you both so much. So much food for thought. Everybody listening will be at different points in their journey on this, and will take so much from it, as have I. Thanks everybody for listening. You'll find links to information and reading list on our website for this podcast soon after it's gone live. Also, you can follow us on Spotify, LinkedIn, wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be putting out another sessions soon, I'm sure. But thank you both, Tony and Julia, very much for your time.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.